on, everyone? Welcome to another episode of Bro History. It's Henry Zamota, my good friend Danny Abdel-Jabbar, and then we are greeted by Matthew Hoh, one of our favorite guests.
Hi, guys. Happy New Year. Thanks for having me back on.
Happy New Year to you as well. And Danny, you wanted to start the conversation, didn't you?
Yeah, for sure. So you've been on the show so many times, and I'm sure regular listeners know everything about you and who you are. But for new listeners, and also just as a quick reminder for the purpose of this conversation, I really wanted to focus on, to start the show, just a little bit of your experience working for the State Department. Tell us a little bit about that experience. Like, when were you working there? You know, what exactly did you do? And a little bit about that, like, day-to-day, kind of workings of working for the State Department.
Yeah. Thanks. I appreciate you asking me. I didn't have a traditional role there. Was fortunate enough, I like to describe it as, because of Forrest Gump-like characteristics and experiences and events, that's how I ended up being in places where I got to see a lot of things that folks my age, men and women my age in my positions normally didn't. And then for some reason, I kept rolling into those positions, and very often positions, particularly in Iraq and Afghanistan, where I wasn't restricted to a straw whole view. So very often when you're in a place like that, you tend to see just your particular area of operations, your particular district, your sector, your province, whatever, or you're at higher levels and you don't ever go out and like walk the streets. And for, essentially, again, Forrest Gump-like reasons, I have positions both in Iraq and Afghanistan with the State Department where I did both. I'd be in meetings with the generals, the ambassadors, governors. I'd be on VTCs, back to video teleconferencing. We called it Zoom, Skype. Now it's, but back then it was always so fraught, particularly if you had to do like a classified one, a secure one. It wasn't going to work, but you still all got around that, machine, and it didn't work. And, but anyway, we do a whole show on how things were in 03, 04, 05, even 09 technology wise. But I had this, I was fortunate to be in positions where I would be at these high level, in a position where I was around senior decision makers, actually because of the way things worked. I oftentimes was involved in those decisions. I shouldn't have been, particularly in my first time in Iraq, where I was 31 years old, but nobody else showed up, in 04 to do those jobs. Okay. I'll get to that in a moment. But, but also too, the next day I would be on a foot patrol, or the next day I'd be working directly with Iraqi engineers on the ground, or, be in a provincial council meeting, or a district or a kata, called an Iraq council meeting, or meeting, walking the streets, going through shops. So I had a very, as I look back, fortunate experience. The wars, of course, themselves, a horror show, but in terms of being able to tell these stories now, the perspective of having seen the wars from multiple levels. So to get to your question about what I was doing with the State Department, first off, I came out of the Marine Corps. I joined the Marine Corps in January 1998, went to officer candidate school, went to Okinawa, spent nearly 3 years there, and then I got sent to the Pentagon, where I was a junior Marine Corps officer on the Secretary of Navy staff. So first real Forrest Gump experience. How that happened, it was essentially because my executive officer, my battalion executive officer back in Okinawa, hated me. I hated him. One day, an opening came up in D.C., a hot fill, as we called it, where someone was leaving and they had to fill it right away. And he said, "Hey, Captain Hoh, how would you like to go to D.C.?" And I said, "Major Fontenot, that sounds great." Because every morning I woke up thinking, what time today am I going to get into a fight with Major Fontenot? And I'm sure he thought the same thing of me. So that's how I end up in D.C. on the personal staff of the Secretary of Navy's office. And I'm there from November of 2002 through April of 2004. So I see the invasion, right, in the first year of the war from that perspective, being on Secretary of Navy staff. So I go from there because I'm in that position. And I'll tell you another story just to show how far off base we all were and how stupid we really were. So again, I'm in the Secretary of Navy's office. I have access to a lot of information. I read briefing slides. I hear people who come out of meetings with the principals, with the Joint Chiefs and things like that. And, through the summer of '03, with regards to Iraq, the not the perception, but the reality, what was being said and understood in the halls of the Pentagon in July of 2003 and August of 2003 was that by the fall of 2003, there would only be 40,000 U.S. troops in Iraq, right? Mm-hmm. And that things were going to work out. Leave it simply like that. I remember my boss, who was the executive assistant to the Secretary of the Navy, I remember him coming to me one day and saying, like, yeah, the Marine Corps is out, and this would have been like June 2003. And so a lot of us who were on duties like this, in the Marine Corps, we called it B billets, the Navy called it shore tours, shore duty. Essentially, you go as an officer, you go from being in the operating units in the fleet, as we called it, to having to go do work in the administrative side of the Marine Corps. So you go and do office jobs like I was doing. You go and you teach in schoolhouses. You go on recruiting duty, or you're on the drill field, or what have you. So this was my B billet, and most of my friends, my peers from going, 1998, who I've been commissioned with, this was their experience too. And we had one guy. His name was Chris Hepler, God bless him. And for some quirk, he actually ended up over in the invasion during Iraq. And I remember he would send us emails from the ship. The subject line would be like, "Dear Draft Dodgers, I'm bringing a camera with me to the war. I'll take pictures. I'll give them to you when I get back so you can show your grandkids what it was like to have been a Marine at war." Like, we really did think we had missed it. And this is not just because of our perceptions, because of what we were hearing as essentially laid down truth coming from the Joint Chiefs and from the Secretary of Defense offices, that we were going to be out of there. The Marine Corps is going to be out of there. The Marine Corps is not going to have any role in this war, and whatever it turned into, it was going to be a police action, essentially. And so I remember in summer of '03 having to make a decision whether I was going to stay in the Marine Corps or not, and feeling as if, I missed the war. I never really thought about doing the Marine Corps as a career. Didn't see myself becoming a colonel or anything like that. So, why not I move on? And in October or so, when it was very clear at this point, it couldn't be denied that this insurgency thing, this resistance thing, was just not a few dead-enders and a few looters and a few ideological or religious lunatics, that it was actually maybe, and they would never use this language, a resistance or a struggle for national liberation against an occupation. Right. I remember in October of '03, my boss coming in and saying to me, "Hey, Captain Ho, I just came out of a meeting with the Joint Chiefs. The Marine Corps is going back to Iraq in '04." Nice. And feeling like, oh my God, I missed it, what I had done. I missed my opportunity to do. So anyway, long story, all of those anecdotes there. I don't know if it helped anybody at all. But,
it was a fun story.
Yeah, but anyway, I end up going to Iraq, though, with as a Department of Defense official on the State Department team. So because I'm in the Secretary of Navy's office, I know people. They get me a job over in Iraq, and it is, again, as a DOD officer on the State Department team, to be part of the embassy over there. And the job was to be a liaison to the Iraqi Ministry of Youth and Sport, and essentially help administer this $20 million grant to rebuild soccer fields and youth centers and community centers and gyms and things like that all throughout Iraq. And so I got to Iraq end of April of '04, I think, maybe beginning of May. And I was there for maybe 2 weeks or so, and they said, hey, this $20 million program that you're going to minister, this insurgency thing really isn't going away. And so we're going to take that and we're going to apply it to other more political or security focused
initiatives. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's not what happened, actually. This was the first time I actually saw the corruption really up front, really right in your face. So this $20 million was just as people understand how the money worked in Iraq, was the cash that came directly out of the Federal Reserve, right? It was on pallets loaded off of aircrafts. It was shrink wrapped, sequentially numbered, fresh money right off the presses, $100 bills packed in, vacuum sealed. And that $20 million was signed right over to SCIRI, the Supreme Council of the Islamic Revolution in Iraq, which was essentially an Iranian-hosted group that had come back into Iraq because of our invasion and were among those who were a part of the governing coalition. And people maybe not be familiar with the Sciri, but they're probably familiar with the Badr Corps. And the Badr Corps was Sciri's militia. And so $20 million, of course, in cash, and in all the corruption, including American hands that were in that as well. Because there were Americans who had come out of the Balkans, where, according, you talk to people who've been doing this for a while, this type of development, humanitarian work, post-war reconstruction, it's a very, very dirty business. And the modern reality of that was defined and put in its current form during the Balkans campaigns, during the Balkans Wars, right? And so what you saw in Iraq in 03 and 04 was Baghdad was populated by all these people who had come out of the Balkans. And they knew exactly what, some of them were doing it because they were good-hearted people. They wanted to rebuild bridges that had been blown up. I mean, like, people who really were into that, a lot of them were just dirty. And many of them were Americans, including my boss there. And this guy signed over my $20 million, mine, it wasn't mine, but the money,
Your
$20 million
$20
I was responsible for, directly to Sciri, so directly to the Badr Corps, right? That buys a lot of rifles and RPGs and other things. And nothing is said about it. You know, I went to this, and of course, the corruption in that, in terms of the cut that this guy, his name was Mansur Fatfat, the cut that Mansur Fatfat and some other people he brought over to the U.S. were taking, it was clear. It was as clear as anything. But you go and you try and talk to the Inspector General about it, the IG there, and well, I'm the, and this was at the end of what was called CPA, Coalition Provisional Authority. CPA was the Department of Defense outfit that was the colonial administration, essentially, of Iraq for the first 15 months or so of our occupation. And then in June, CPA transitioned out and the State Department came in. Iraq received its sovereignty, put that in quotes, of course, that word sovereignty. And then, so what you had to really help the corruption along at the end, where money could just go missing, was the fact, as Department of Defense handed over to the State Department, you had people pointing fingers at each other. So when I went into the Department of Defense IG to say, look, man, this money just got stolen, essentially. He said, I can't do anything about it. I'm leaving. And then when the State Department guy came in, he said, well, I wasn't here when that happened. I can't do anything about it. So it was masterful. It was brilliant how this corruption was carried out, how the theft was occurring within a year of the war. And of course, people are familiar with, when I was actually in this, and I saw this before I even got there, because we had an acting Secretary of the Navy, a guy named H.T. Johnson, who had been a former 4-star general in the Air Force. Gordon England, who is, if you talk to people who know about the disaster that is Navy shipbuilding, if people are familiar with the reality of the United States Navy, how it can't build ships, people who understand it will point to Gordon England as being one of the key factors in the destruction of American naval shipbuilding capacity. But anyway, Gordon England, he gets assigned over to Homeland Security as Secretary of the Navy's office to become Tom Ridge's first deputy at Homeland Security. Ridge, to his credit, within 3 or 4 months realizes this guy's completely incompetent, fires him. And so at that point, we had this acting Secretary of the Navy, a guy named H.T. Johnson, who, again, former Air Force 4-star, he gets involved with this other guy named Doug Coombs, who was this really slimy Republican operative who was on the Secretary of the Navy staff. They go over. Coombs and Johnson go over. The former 4-star and acting Secretary of the Navy go over to Iraq, and they run a company called Custer Battles. And this company, if people want to look that up, you'll see just how egregious they were, how just sloppy they were in their theft. My favorite story about them, and they were also involved with some other company over there too, was that they had the Iraqi airport, the Baghdad airport buyout. They had forklifts there already. But this company came in, they were given the contract to administer the airport. And what they simply did was they simply repainted the forklifts, said they purchased them from some American company or whatever, and charged the United States government, God knows what, for these, for these forklifts that they basically had just, taken from, that were already sitting there. So, but that's the type of corruption was flowing in and out. I mean, you saw the corruption as well in the sense that people who are familiar with CPA, and I know I'm talking about stuff that you guys probably didn't want to talk about.
No, this is fantastic. Keep going. Keep going.
But like the people who are familiar with CPA understand it to have been a Republican Party operation, and that was totally the case. My friend, the guy who got me the job, over in Baghdad. He was a surface warfare officer who had been in my office and Secretary of Navy's office. He got sent down to the Coalition Provisional Authority Human Resources Office. And Ken would say this is exactly what happens. The first thing they look for is this guy a part or is this gal a part of the Republican Party? And, when I got there to Baghdad, as CPA was ending, you talk to these people who've been there for a few months. Hardly any of them had been there for more than a few months, and I'll get to that in a minute why that was. But, you'd say to them, oh, what are you going to do when you get home? I'm not really too sure, but I know I'll be at the convention in the summer, right? The Republican National Convention in 2004. And so it was this Republican operation. The only thing that mattered was your loyalty. And why they were only there for a few months at a time, most of these people, they came out of essentially out of the congressional Republican offices, mostly young people. And was because what you could do there is you could say that you were working 120 hours a week and nobody would say anything about it, right? And they had some justification for it because technically you weren't sleeping in your bed because you were temporarily assigned from D.C. to Baghdad. And there's some this type of administrative bureaucratic jujitsu they would spew out about why this is legal. And of course it wasn't legal, but no one ever did anything about it. No one was ever going to do anything about it.
Are they getting paid by the hour?
Essentially, you were getting paid by the hour over there as an official with the Coalition Provisional Authority. It was this weird system. Anyway, because I had to do my whole year there, I had to do a timesheet. It was, but what you had though was if you're part of the federal service, you can only make so much per year for your pay grade. So if you go over to Baghdad and you've left the congressional service, right? You've left the legislative branch, you're now in the executive branch. So whatever you earned with Congress doesn't count. Right. So now that you're starting out, your earnings for the year are zero. Well, as fast as you can max out that money, you can leave Baghdad. So this is why guys would only be over there for 3 or 4 months. Because they're
working 120 hours a week.
Exactly. Let's say they're working 120 hours a week. They max out with 7 days a week. They max out the pay scale. And then they go back to their job back in Congress, right? Go back to their staff job. They'd high five some other person who was coming over to do the same thing too. And then most disgusting, of this whole thing, it still makes me sick. I feel like I probably should crack a bottle open as I talk to you about this. These guys would go back to D.C. and it was called the Bremer look, where they would wear their suits and walk around D.C. with desert combat boots on. That was a thing. Lame. That was a thing that existed in D.C., not just for the first year of the war, but you'd see guys in 05, 06 still doing that. These are people who never left the green zone, but they're,
unearned valor, 100%.
It was just, so anyway, getting to the point about what I was doing there. So I'm in this Ministry of Youth and Sport job. Obviously, I'm not going to go around the country and rebuild soccer fields, like I thought I might be doing. So they moved me up to Tikrit, and they put me in this position where I'm on the State Department team in Tikrit, and I'm responsible for reconstruction. I'm giving direct responsibility for the reconstruction in Saladin province, which is where Tikrit is, which is Saddam Hussein's hometown, essentially. And I'm also giving overall responsibility, general responsibility for reconstruction in 4 provinces. And again, I'm 31 years old. Right, I'm coming out as a captain in the Marine Corps, comm engineer background, so I've got some project management training, but that's it, And it was supposed to have been 15 of us doing this, and I think at most we had 5 people, I was the first one there. I was the senior guy, and it was the deal where again the money was present. I was on it because of your State Department. This is how I'm connected to the State Department. I'm part of the embassy. And because I've got this position of being the coordinator for reconstruction for these 4 provinces, I'm involved in a lot, and I've got to deal with a lot. And I've also got direct responsibility for one of the provinces, which means I've got $50 million in cash that I control. So I used to keep this money in a safe in my bedroom. At one point, I had the most I ever had at one point in my possession was $26 million just in the safe in my bedroom. Yeah, and
what does that even? How many stacks of
you
bills
could?
Is that?
You could, if people are familiar with your standard military duffel bag, what we call it in the Marine Corps, sea bag.
Yeah.
That 3.5 foot green duffel bag.
Yep.
You can get $6.5 million in that.
Oh shit!
Because when we ran low on money, we had to get on a helicopter, fly down to Baghdad, go to the vault, get the money. One time, I didn't do this trip. The 2 guys I had working with me or working for me did it, and Brian and Chris, and the helicopter, they missed it or broke or whatever, and they had to stay overnight with $6.5 million in duffel bag, sleeping on the flight line.
Jesus.
But so
clutching their weapon at that point, right?
one of them, they told me one of them stayed awake at all times. So, but so that was the experience I had there of being at those multiple levels, right?
Mm-hmm.
So through that program, that direct program in Saladin province, I was employing 3,000 Iraqis. I was administering dozens of projects, putting sewer and water lines in, repaving streets, putting air conditioners or furniture in schools, whatever. You can imagine all the different things you could do. But most of that money was used as a weapon. The Army actually had a doctrine, or Department of Defense had a doctrine called money as a weapon system. And so, this is where I really start to get involved with counterinsurgency, because I'm on the non-kinetic side of that, along with some of the guys in the Army who were administering what's called SERP, the Commander's Emergency Response Program, which is also the same thing, spending cash, this idea that if we build wells and schools and, they'll accept that we're occupying them, right? This great fantasy that if we give them money, they will just accept that these foreigners are occupying us and all will be okay, right? And so you saw there with that, every week as I was spending anywhere from $500,000 to $2 or $3 million a week in terms of paying out to people, the insurgency just got worse and worse. And the Army was doing about the same amount. And then we had the large reconstruction programs come in, $16 billion appropriated by the Congress. And so, that was my experience there, and going back down to the embassy every 4 or 5 weeks. So that was my experience at State Department, and how I got involved with it. And because of that, when I left Iraq after 13 months, I went to State. They couldn't hire me on as a direct hire, so they hired me on as a consultant or a contractor, whatever you want to call it. And myself and a couple other guys like me filled out the Iraq desk at the State Department. And so I go from that position there to being part of the working groups that were, directly reporting people. And they're actually, some of the people in those working groups reported directly to the principals, including the vice president. So you had this experience then of seeing the policy making around the world being done through the interagency process. So in our meetings, you'd have guys from DOD, from Treasury, from Justice, CIA, etc. And, you could see how this was a war being won by the most vapid, politically ambitious imbeciles you could ever come across. Because what happened was that it was clear the civilian control. So you'd have these, you always felt bad because you have these colonels, these guys with 25, 26 years in the military. They spent their whole life waiting for a war. They're at the top levels. They're in the interagency team. They're supposed to be putting the plan together about how we're going to win the war in Iraq. And they got to deal with 26 and 27-year-old kids who work for the vice president of the United States, who waltz in 15 minutes late to every meeting with a steaming hot cup of Starbucks. Like that type of just like, I can't believe this is who is running the war. And the reality is that the war was being run by the vice president's office. The Department of Defense, Rumsfeld, of course, huge role as well. But this idea that you had some type of interagency planning process where you had the best minds brought together, and every week they said, "Oh, what happened in Iraq this week? Okay, maybe we need to adjust. We should think about that, or what about this thing?" No, that's not existed whatsoever at all. And this is, you're talking about fall of 2005, winter of 2005, late summer of 2005. And I was part of drafting what we called the National Strategy for Victory in Iraq, the NSVI. And this document was how we're going to win the war. And just to show you how out of touch Washington, D.C. was with the actual war, when Lieutenant General Vines, who was the Corps commander, so the head of all ground forces in Iraq, American, British, Polish, whoever, this Lieutenant General Vines was the head of all the ground forces there. When some reporter asked him about the National Strategy for Victory in Iraq, he said, "I've never heard of it." Right? So that's like how disassociated, it really was. It was, if you were, you'd have to bring a Heller or a Vidal or someone like that in to write the degree of satire and sarcasm and cynicism necessary to portray what Washington, D.C. was like as the headquarters of this war effort.
It sounds like a macabre comedy. Like, it sounds like
it is.
a very dark comedy.
It really was, and I've thought about writing about it. I never do it, but I always had the best. Give you an idea how I'd open up the screenplay for this thing, and it would be we had all kinds in the Green Zone in Baghdad, going into 2004. We had all kinds of restaurants in there, including a Chinese restaurant with guys from China running it, and supposedly a massage parlor right above it.
A special massage parlor, or just a regular one?
That was my understanding. Yeah, I mean, that was, of course, that was going to be there. And it was there before. I mean, like, it wasn't like the Iraqis didn't. We brought prostitution with their occupation. They had it already.
Fair.
We just did it in a different manner, right? We were probably more overt and more grotesque about it. But but anyway, this Chinese restaurant's right there in the middle of the Green Zone. Food was pretty good. Next to it was the CASH, Combat Surgical Hospital. So you'd have the helicopters coming in, blowing up these kids from Iowa and Chicago and, wherever.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember one time sitting there eating Chinese food. Helo comes over, a helicopter comes over, a medevac helicopter, right? So some kid is in there. God knows what he's like, right? Legs gone, guts hanging out. He's dead, whatever, And I remember this woman who had a fairly senior position at CPA saying, those helicopters are so annoying. And that's how I would open up the screenplay. If I was to do something like that about Iraq, that would be the opening scene. Some poor kid bleeding out on a helo, doesn't know what the hell he was doing in Iraq in the first place. We think he did. It's all wrong because it was all based on lies. Dying out on a helicopter, or maybe who knows, maybe he lives. But the reality is that you've got these staffers, the people supposedly running the war, eating Chinese food and saying his medevac helicopter is
Netflix, if you're listening, I smell a dark sitcom.
Yeah, so it really was. So, so I'm at state there. I see what state's like internally. Again, Forrest Gump-like. I'm in senior positions. I'm writing stuff that goes to the desk of the president, the vice president, the secretary of state every week. And that whole farce as well. I used to write what's called this weekly status report. And you had to every week provide good news stories. It was supposed to be an objective. This is what's happening in Iraq. That went to the principals. It also went to the media. An unclassified version went to the media, went to members of Congress, And every week I would kill myself trying to put together this, report of how we're winning the Iraq War, And it was just an exercise in, it was madness. Again, another, you get the greatest screenwriters and satirists and everything else to try and explain what the inanity of it all was, and those reports would go directly to the president and go directly to the vice president and the secretary of state, so had that type of, where I was, I could see that interaction.
Well, Matt, can I ask you something? What would go into one of those reports?
You could probably still find them online. If people Google Iraq Weekly Status Report, there would be a host of things. There'd be slides with metrics, with graphs. So how much oil, what's the oil output? Because I remember when the oil output drastically collapsed. I remember being in the airport in Boston, Logan Airport, and I'm sitting there waiting for my plane, and I'm watching the TV, and it's CNN or it's C-SPAN or something like that. And John Murtha, the Democratic congressman, former Marine, Democratic congressman from Pennsylvania, who was one of the first and the loudest to turn against the war, was standing there on television, right, with one of my slides in his hand saying, their own information tells us we're losing this war, And so there would be that type of information, of course, casualties in terms of, as well as how many, IED attacks, how many rocket attacks. There'd be political information in there. So we would, what's happening with various, what's occurring, in terms of the various factions in Iraq. What's the status of the elections? How the elections moving forward? So all just about 45 pages of PowerPoint slides that you put together from input from both in Iraq and within D.C., most of it coming actually from within D.C., and then, there'd always have to be the good news stories. So you do everything you can to demonstrate some kind of progress, or show like smiling Iraqi faces, so that, the president would see like pictures of young Iraqi boys and girls who have been democratized, so that was how the official information about how the war was going went to, again, not to working groups, not to the deputies, but to the principals themselves, right? So the vice president wanted to have the official, and his mind was made up about the war anyway. It wasn't going to matter. But if he wanted to have the official data on the war, this report I wrote every week or compiled every week was one of the sources for him. Is printed out and put on his desk. I mean, I would print it out and bring it up to the secretary's office. And, go right there. So the guy from the diplomatic security or one of their admin people would take it and bring it to her desk. And it was just like when you understand what the reality was like there in terms of who the decision making were, the characters involved. Well, the whole war itself, right? The whole I forget who said it, but essentially, if 25 people didn't exist, the Iraq War would never have happened. Maybe it's not even that number. I mean, so you really start to see how personalities, how the culture of Washington, D.C., the culture of the political parties, the ideologies, and then, of course, the money involved in all this, had such a powerful role in determining how decisions were made about the war. And that's how something like the war in Iraq can continue for years and years. And it's not until 2006 when we actually negotiate with the Sunnis, and then later when we do it essentially with Muqtada al-Sadr as well, but that took a lot of violence before that happened. But I remember I leave the State Department and I get mobilized. I'm still a reservist in the Marine Corps. I get mobilized and I go back to Iraq. And I'm in command of a company of Marines in Anbar province. And this is 2006 now you're talking about, into 2007. And so I'm Anbar province at that point, the most violent part of Iraq outside of Baghdad. And, you just, I'm there though for what was known as the Sunni awakening for the Sons of Iraq. This is when we essentially just said to the Sunnis who were fighting us, why are you fighting us? And they said, because you're occupying us. And we said, well, what can we do about it? And they said, well, you can give us back control of our cities and towns. You can get these Shia and Kurdish soldiers and policemen out of our cities and town, and you can cut us back into revenue from the government. And we did that. And within literally days, we went from having, in my regiment's area of operation, dozens upon dozens of what we called TICs, troops in contact, basically firefights,
engagements.
Engagements. I mean, just, yeah. And we went from dozens a day, to one or two, and the Sunni resistance, they turned Al-Qaeda right over to us, and then one of the fascinating things you really saw then was just how small the foreign jihadist element was within the insurgency or the resistance within Iraq. I mean, you're talking about essentially an Anbar, West. I mean, there might be 4, 5, 6, 7 members of Al-Qaeda in each of the cities. That was it. So the Sunnis turned those guys over to us. They said they're over in that house. And we sent in Delta or the SEALs or Marine Recon or whoever, killed those guys or put them in Abu Ghraib or Camp Bucca. And then, of course, they got together and they created ISIS, a few years later.
Years later, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. But, you saw all that, right? You saw just the stupidity, the vapidity of this, in the destruction, the death, the suffering that still goes on, right? The sorrow, the grief. Look, Iraq is the reality of Iraq is that every month in Iraq, you still have dozens killed, of civilians killed in what you could describe as political violence, but essentially dozens are still killed every month in Iraq as an extension of our wars there. And certainly you can't start that in 2003. You have to go through the 90s where we were bombing Iraq every third or fourth day, back to the 91 first Iraq war. And then, of course, back through the Iran-Iraq war, which was a proxy war for you.
That's right.
So, you're right. I mean, so you see, but when you have this around you, and you also have the knowledge of what the decision makers are like. Yeah, it's no wonder why I've got a psychological my psychiatrist book is an inch thick on me, right?
Wow. I mean, didn't know it was going to go there.
No,
But
I mean,
fantastic story.
yeah, I know you want to talk about state. I mean, I ended up going into the State Department.
Sure.
Right. I get direct appointment into the State Department because I know the folks on their Iraq desk, and so a guy named Henry Ensher, who becomes the director of operations for Afghanistan for the State Department. I worked with Henry in Iraq, and so when I was back in D.C. and looking to go into the State Department, and my ex-girlfriend at State said, "Hey, we're gonna do some direct hires and send put people directly into the Foreign Service and send them to Afghanistan. Are you interested?" I said, "Absolutely." And then she said to Henry, "Hey, Matt's interested." He said, "Great." And so me and this woman who had been shoot, now I'm blanking on his name. Bill Richardson's foreign policy advisor. We were appointed directly into the Foreign Service and sent to Afghanistan. And there, same kind of thing, had a role where I saw the war from all levels. I was a political officer over there with the Foreign Service, so I saw the role from all levels. So I was also up in the East as well as down in the South. So I saw the war in several provinces. And, the reality for me getting there in 2009 was that the war in Afghanistan was no different than the war in Iraq. And you could waste your time talking about all the tactical or operational differences, the historical differences, the cultural differences, the geography, the difference in the people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you just missing the whole point that the only thing that matters is occupation by a foreign army. That's all that matters. Nothing else matters at all. And so you have that realization, and you're realizing I realized as well that the Obama administration was no different at all than the Bush administration in a sense of this war, the expansion of the war in 2009 by the Obama administration was done for domestic political reasons. Also as well to throw a bone to the Pentagon, give them a chance to get a W, because no one was ever going to give a win to the Pentagon for Iraq. That's how Gates saw it. Clinton, of course, saw this as a chance to burnish her resume so that she could run in 2016 as a because in the United States, right, particularly in American politics, in order to be a strong woman, you have to act like a violent man, right? I mean, so that's that's the way Clinton, I think, is looking at this. And there's some really good work that's been done on that, particularly with what occurs in Libya a few years later, and how in the New York Times, they'll come to me in a minute, guy who authored Scott Shane authors a big piece in the New York Times around 2012, 2013 about the decision making for the U.S. and the NATO involvement in Libya, and that so much of it for Hillary Clinton was about having something to show on the campaign trail of how she was as tough and as strong as any man could be, right? As well as being smart about the new way of war and everything else, and making people forget about Afghanistan and Iraq, And after being in Afghanistan for 5 months or so, I resigned in protest over the escalation of that war. And now, 15 years later, I'm sitting here talking to you guys.
So the web that you laid out, it's so complex. We wanted to talk about what makes a good diplomat or what makes a good Secretary of State, but given the way that decisions are made, it's really hard to identify who are even the key decision makers. Who are the people who are running the shots? Because it seems like it's just decision by committee, and given that it's decision by committee, it's people who are making decisions are making them for to stay in that committee, essentially. They're doing it to they're making decisions that their superiors want to.
They're a bunch of early 30-somethings with no experience.
Yeah. I could say for the Iraq War, because I was around the decision makers, it was the office of the vice president. When the people from OVP, when the vice president's office came into the meeting, that's when the meeting started, right? And it was that type of anything that was said or done. If they said, "Nah, we don't like it," meaning the vice president's not going to like it, it just was off the table immediately. And Rumsfeld and the Pentagon had a larger role than anybody else, but nothing compared to the VP. And then so someone like Condoleezza Rice, in charge of the State Department at that point, has very little input on this. Very little role in it. She's essentially, you see in Afghanistan, with the Afghanistan decision making, this I get more from my discussions directly with Ambassador Eikenberry, who was the ambassador at the time, former 3-star general, who had been in charge of American forces in Afghanistan before that, as well as the late Richard Holbrooke, who was a special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan affairs. What they would tell me, as well as what I could see myself just from being at State, knowing people there, knowing the director of operations and everything else, was that the decisions for the escalation of that war were institutional in many ways, but also driven by people like Rahm Emanuel and David Axelrod, right? This idea that, look, Barack, if you want to have a successful first term, if you want to get reelected, well, one, you need to not be ever accused of being soft on terrorism. Your middle name's Hussein, for Christ's sake, right?
Yeah.
If a bomb goes off in Times Square after you started pulling troops out of Afghanistan, they will crucify you and you will not win re-election, right? Mm-hmm. You'll play right into their most feverish 2012 dreams of what they can do. Mm-hmm. So there was all that. You saw institutionally, again, this idea of the Pentagon needing a win, needing to validate itself, needing to cleanse itself from Iraq. You saw the career ego, the maniacal aspects of people like David Petraeus and McChrystal, blanking on his first name, Stan McChrystal, and their belief that this will make us the greatest generals of our generation, right? We're in 4th generation warfare, or 5th generation warfare, whatever it is. We are going to be the people that the history books write about. And you saw some of that too, because don't forget, like in 2010 or 2011, the United States Congress was talking about giving Petraeus a 5th star. If people need a shock, Google that. General Petraeus, 5th star. I think that was like 2011, 2012.
Doesn't
right?
only like George Washington have a 5th star?
No, we had that title. It's titled General of the Armies or Admiral of the Navies, and we had, I think, 9 of them in World War II.
Okay, but still, right? not a whole lot.
War we won with our allies against Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany. Right? Mm-hmm. We have 15 million men under arms. Right, and they want to get Petraeus a 5th star for losing Iraq, losing Afghanistan, right? Being in charge of an army of 450,000 or however many it was at the time, right?
5th star becomes a participation trophy.
Spending $120 billion a year on the war in Afghanistan, right? So when you kind of put all that together, and then of course too, you see like what Holbrooke and Eikenberry would tell me about the meetings regarding Afghanistan. So what happens is Obama comes into office in 2009. And he had campaigned on winning the good war, right? That Iraq was a mistake. Iraq was the wrong war. We should have kept our focus on the right war. I'm going to fix it. And he takes advantage of the fact that Bush had already signed the agreement to get the U.S. out of Iraq in the summer of 2008. But then he, also has to live up to this commitment to win the war in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. And on the campaign trail, if you go and look, you'll find that when his advisors are pressed about what do they mean by sending more forces to Afghanistan, he talks about like 2 brigades. He talks about 10,000 troops, 15,000 troops maybe, but not what eventually comes. And immediately you have 40,000 troops sent to Afghanistan and Barack Obama comes into office, almost kind of under whose authority. I'm not sure if everyone's ever delineated how it happened, but it just happened. Mm-hmm. And so by the time you get to the great debate about the surge in Afghanistan, U.S. forces in Afghanistan have gone from 30,000 the year before to now 70,000. Mm-hmm. And so what you have then is this pressure put on Barack Obama with almost no help to him to fight off this additional escalation. And I give Obama credit to a degree with all this because he knew it wasn't going to work. He still went along with it, but he did know it wasn't going to work. You can see that clearly if you read Bob Woodward's Obama's Wars and things like that. See, it's very clear that he was entirely skeptical, didn't believe in the snake oil of counterinsurgency and what these guys were pushing. And you could see through Petraeus and McChrystal. But talking to Eichenberg and Holbrook about what it was like in those meetings, they were on the chairs on the side of the wall. They weren't at the table, and they weren't allowed to speak about the war. Everything came through Hillary Clinton. And so what you had then, of course, was Hillary Clinton, who was one of the chief principals in pushing for a win in Afghanistan. Certainly that relationship between her and people like General Petraeus shouldn't surprise anybody. But this, Gates wanted to do it to give the Pentagon something. And Biden, there was this nonsense a few years ago about Biden when Biden rightfully pulled the troops out of Afghanistan in 21. That he had been against the escalation. He had argued in 2009 to pull the troops out then. That's just complete nonsense. That's complete bull. What Biden was arguing for in 2009 was that the U.S. in the fall there, Obama, we had already moved up to 70,000 troops, that the U.S. send 20,000 more. McChrystal's plan was to send 40,000 more. Obama split the difference and sent 30,000 more, right? And so at the end of it all, the Biden plan would have had 90,000 troops in Afghanistan as opposed to 100,000 Americans, plus 100,000 contractors, plus about 40,000 NATO troops. So by the summer of 2010, you're looking at about a 250,000 man army in Afghanistan from the West, and we all know how that worked out.
Not very well.
Yeah,
particularly
for the Afghan people, right?
Yeah, seriously. Following that track, though, so if we're talking about like in the Bush years with Condoleezza Rice, her role bit limited, State Department wise in terms of like that decision making. But then that seems to ratchet a bit up when it comes to Hillary Clinton when she's got the helm of the State Department. Now suddenly the State Department's got a bit more power. So it seems like there's a little bit of a shifting power dynamic. It really just depends on the personality in that role.
Yeah.
So I think I want to start the conversation around that State Department figurehead, right? So as everyone probably knows right now, Marco Rubio is slated to, is the pick for Trump to be the next Secretary of State. I'd like to talk a little bit about him and where we think he might slot in terms of, a good or bad figurehead for the State Department. Now, he's not yet confirmed, right? And it's January 7th when we're recording this. That hearing is set to come on the 15th of this month. So maybe this is an irrelevant conversation because he doesn't get confirmed. But for fun, let's talk about it. And then more broadly, let's talk about like what might make for a good State Department official.
Yeah, I don't think that's Marco Rubio. I think.
So he'll be. So you're saying he's going to be confirmed?
I assume. So. I haven't. To be fair, I haven't kept up with that.
I haven't heard anything. He hasn't been on the list of controversial figures. It's more been it's been aimed towards obviously Gates, and then it's been aimed towards
Hegseth, and they're all upset about Gabbard as well. They're very upset about Gabbard, the Democrats.
Yeah.
She's a Russian agent.
Yeah, exactly.
I guess the reason why I wanted to talk about specifically the State Department bit is because there are conflicts around the world, big ones, that we are either directly involved with or like indirectly involved with. And it seems like military option is on the table, but everyone seems to forget about like diplomacy. And so the diplomatic figurehead of the state, the Secretary of State, seems like it would be a really important pick. And given that we talk a lot about, these geopolitics, I'm like wondering, is Marco Rubio or literally anyone that they put in that field, how are they going to be equipped to help stave off like actual hot conflict, And
just to add more context to that question, Danny. So we're in a period where we don't know who runs the country, and we definitely don't know who runs the foreign policy. Yeah. So I think many people are confused on, who is making decisions. And like the web of people that you just laid out who are running the Iraq war is, we're going to have to like look at the transcript, just because I'm not saying that you convoluted it. I'm just saying it is extremely convoluted.
Right.
We want a simple answer. Who's in charge here? Who's in charge here? So naturally we look at who should. So naturally, over the past 4 years, Biden's brain is oatmeal. So obviously he's not in charge. So we're looking at, okay, I guess Tony Blinken is in charge? Like,
Or Kamala Harris?
It seems more that Jake Sullivan has been the one. Blinken certainly very high profile, and he certainly has his views that I think agree with Blinken in many ways. With Sullivan in many ways, but from what I read and from what I hear, it seems that Sullivan is the one who's making the decisions.
So that's the National Security Advisor, right?
He's the National Security Advisor.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Well, is he any good?
Yeah.
I go back and look at all your podcasts from the last 4 years, and you guys tell me
it's not. Then it's a no.
I think every administration is going to be different. Look at the Bush years, and Cheney was really he really had the final say on things. He was the last. You hear this phrase about being the last person in the room with somebody. And, Cheney was that guy with Bush. And you talk to people like Larry Wilkerson and others who were familiar with what went on in that context. And yeah, absolutely. Cheney was the last guy there, and he was very, very persuasive. Wilkerson will tell a story about how so Larry Wilkerson was the chief of staff to Colin Powell. Colin Powell was Secretary of State in the first George W. Bush term. And, that they had gotten where they were sending an envoy over to North Korea. And people forget about the Bush administration's attempts to deal diplomatically with the North Koreans, and then also, too, how they kind of blew it all up. And they were able to get this guy, forget who it was, but they were able to get him on his way to North Korea because Cheney was out duck hunting or something. And as he was like halfway there, refueling in Guam or someplace. Remember he shot a guy in the face and was duck hunting one time?
Didn't he get that guy to apologize? It's super weird. So he must have been very very persuasive.
And then not only that, the White House spokesperson told the media, the national media, we didn't tell you because we didn't think it was a big deal. I remember watching the press conference, and one of the reporters, deadpan back to the spokesperson, says, the Vice President of the United States shooting another man in the face is not a big deal, But that was right. But anyway, the Wilkerson's story is that this guy's, and again, I can't remember who the envoy was, but he's like halfway to Korea and halfway to North Korea. He's refueling, in Guam or wherever. And Cheney finds out, and that's it. Guy still goes there and everything else, but what they were attempting to achieve, what they're attempting to offer, you guys should have Larry Wilkerson on to talk about this stuff. Was Vice President found out and he stopped it. And you can imagine those stories over and over and over again. With Rubio, how much of a role he will have in the White House, certainly you could see how prevalent and how prominent Mike Waltz has been, who's going to be Trump's national security advisor. And you could imagine someone like Waltz wanting to be or intending to be the decision maker with Donald Trump on all these issues. He has that persona, he has that attitude, he has that gravitas. So I would speculate and say with Rubio, and Rubio has always been a hawk. He's a neocon. He's been for the, sending weapons to Ukraine. He's happy to maybe get into a war with Russia. I don't know, but certainly huge backer of Israel, certainly anti-China. But I think for Rubio, what we're going to see is probably a focus on the Caribbean and Central and South America. He has built his chops on his Cuban heritage.
Okay,
right?
So he's going to play the token.
Yeah, I think he's, even though from what I understand, I think his family came over during the Batista's regime and not under Castro. Uh-huh. But the Rubio, I think that will be his focus, and then you'll see a focus on Venezuela. And a buddyship, with Milei in Argentina, right? And more of the nonsense of maybe more coups. Certainly, the idea of seizing and controlling the rare earth minerals that are in South America.
Color revolutions are to come.
You can see with Rubio, he's going to give you could see him not caring too much about what's going on with Europe, what's going on with Israel, what's going on with China, because he generally agrees with what they're doing, But I have a feeling, just a gut feeling, that his focus is going to be on, southern hemisphere on our neighboring our neighbors in Central and South America. Because that's what he's been doing. That's what he's so concerned about. That's what his whole identity is based upon. So
you know what he'll do? He'll be finger wagging like countries like Brazil whenever they like protest Israel. I think that will be one of his roles. You know how some IDF soldier was being investigated
in Brazil. Yeah,
he was on vacation in Brazil. I'm sure you heard this story, and he ended up. Ironic. How weird does it sound? He had to flee to Argentina. Right?
You can't make this shit up.
Flew to Argentina. What other?
Yeah, the
to
story
avoid war
keeps
crimes.
the story keeps completing itself, right? Yeah. The irony of it, right? All the, when I was in Palestine back in November, we met with October 7th survivors and rabbis in the town of Sderot settlement outside of Gaza, 7 kilometers from Gaza, so inside the Gaza envelope, as they say. And these folks would say stuff, they were peace activists. They said we were for a ceasefire on October 8th, and everything else. But the Palestinians need to rise up and get rid of Hamas, and if they don't have the courage to do that, then we can't do anything on our side. And war is terrible. And it got to the point where I asked them, "Can you hear the bombing? Can you hear the airstrikes?" And I knew they could because it's 7 kilometers away.
Right.
3,000-pound bomb is loud as hell.
Right.
So they could hear it because what it sounded to me. And I didn't say this, but then I had a colleague who said as well, because he was feeling the same thing, was that very much this thing of like, we didn't know what was happening to those Jews on the trains going into Auschwitz. We don't know what's happening in Gaza. We're not sure what's going on. I know you have your reports, but we're not seeing that, that type of, so just that, that's a huge segue, huge jump into a topic we weren't even discussing, but, certainly, I don't know how Rubio. He's been very. Maybe I've missed it. I feel like he's been very quiet the last several weeks. He has
been. Yeah, admittedly, I've been looking.
Yeah. Okay.
So
good.
let's talk about this Michael Waltz guy, because I don't know shit about him, and I just pulled up his Wikipedia. So apparently, he is an American politician, businessman, and author. He was a colonel in the U.S. Army. He was the first Green Beret to be elected to Congress, which is interesting. So he's got obviously military chops, military background. I forgot to mention he's a Republican, so I don't know if that obviously
didn't he work for Flynn?
I mean,
that's Kellogg who worked for him.
Yeah, so Waltz is a pretty interesting. Unlike the vast majority of the Hawks in Washington D.C., he's not a chicken hawk. The guy was a special forces. He led teams in war. The guy certainly has the bona fides. He has the credibility behind him, unlike Marco Rubio, right? Unlike almost all the neoconservatives. I just saw a list the other day of neoconservatives who came out of the PNAC, the Project for a New American Century, and John Bolton was like the only one who had actually served in the U.S. military. Bolton, of course, who joined the National Guard in Maryland to avoid getting drafted into Vietnam. That was his military service, right? But, you saw, so at least to Waltz's credit, but Waltz, at the same time, he ends up being a special forces in the National Guard.
Right.
And Waltz ends up becoming the Deputy National Security Advisor, I believe, for counterterrorism for Vice President Dick Cheney.
I'm reading that to you.
That starts the roll. And then he's down in Florida, and he's back. Well, no, he's back into the Pentagon, and in I believe it's 2012, he leaves the Pentagon. I might have my timeline mixed up here, but at some point he leaves the Pentagon, and very smartly, very astutely, because he knows how the system works, he starts a consulting business, a contracting business, and starts selling his business back to the Pentagon. So here you have a guy who had who was a colonel in special forces, high profile, very important roles in the vice president's office, as well as within the Department of Defense. I think he had some time in the Congress as well, working staff work. So then he starts his business. And 6-7 years later, he sells it for like $100 million.
Yep, $92 million. It was Pacific Architects and Engineers. Yeah.
and in you've got to think of, so is it around 16 or so, he ends up running for Congress, gets into Congress. Was it around then, 16 or so?
See, he started, oh man, this is so messy.
But whatever,
2018.
2018. Okay, yeah. So he does. He has he has 6 years in the Congress. Very prominent. If you follow national security affairs, you see his voice often. He is very much uncompromising. His views are very clear. The dominance of the American empire cannot be questioned. Essentially, the hammer must be dropped on anyone who raises their hand against it. That type of attitude. So very imperial mindset. He very much is an officer of the empire, right? He sees himself just as many of the generals that Trump brought in his first administration. So talking about Mattis and Kelly, particularly. Dog. Yeah, Mad Dog Mattis, who became Secretary of Defense, and John Kelly, Marine Corps 4-star general, who became Trump's first chief of staff. These are men who really believe themselves to be modern day legionaries, right? They really do see themselves, their purpose being in the borderlands, protecting the empire against the barbarians, right? Well, and of course, expanding, the empire as needed, not just maintaining it. So, and that's something I think too, we point out all these cries about Trump being an isolationist. And besides his comments about Ukraine and about Israel, his major foreign policy mentions and talks and discussions and has been about buying Greenland, right? Taking the Panama Canal.
Oh, I just read today he wants to change the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the fact, what an affront to the empire that huge lake south of us has been called Mexico and not America, right? He refers to, and this is kind of funny, he refers to Trudeau as Governor Trudeau. I mean, you got to admit the guy is kind of funny at times.
State, all of Canada.
Yeah, it does, exactly. You see that this idea that somehow this guy is not going to be an imperial president, or he was not an imperial president. He just has a different conception of what the empire should look like. Right?
Okay.
But Waltz fits all into this, and Waltz will be his national security advisor. And, Waltz, there's nothing where you can say Waltz has any desire to do anything other than military force. I'm not sure of one issue whatsoever.
So little sidebar, reading this Wikipedia article and also discussing it with you right now, this Michael Waltz guy kind of scares me a little bit in terms of we've got a lot of this hot shit happening, and I feel dirty for saying this, to give Trump some credit. He didn't really start any wars in the first term. And he had some pretty crazy people in there too, so.
Well, if you remember what he does in Afghanistan was he comes in and he lets them open it up in Afghanistan. Part of that is because focus of the U.S. military had been Syria and Iraq for the preceding 5 years or so. So 2017, 2018, as the United States, its Iraqi allies, as Syria, Russia, Hezbollah defeat the Islamic State, you now have the ability of the American Air Force and Navy to focus their firepower on Afghanistan. So people, we were dropping a ton of bombs in Syria and Iraq. The people Google what Mosul looked like when the Islamic State was finally defeated in Mosul. Looks like Stalingrad. Looks like Gaza, essentially. Yeah. So we were dropping so many bombs that we were running out of bombs. Other commands, Southern Command, Pacific Command, were sending their stores, their stocks, their munitions to Central Command, because Central Command, or the manufacturers of the bombs, couldn't keep up enough. That's how many bombs we were dropping in Syria and Iraq during that time period. So what happens is when that dies down and they're able to refocus on Afghanistan, Trump goes with Mattis and Kelly and McMaster, who was his national security advisor, H.R. McMaster, Army 4-star, Army General, 3-star, I think. But and allows them to open up on Afghanistan. And Trump in his first year drops more bombs on Afghanistan than Obama and Bush combined.
Whoa.
So the violence that's inflicted on Afghanistan in 2018, going into 2019 is massive.
Okay, so no new
so,
wars, but massive escalation in the existing
exactly,
one.
escalation. So he didn't start any new ones, but he didn't end any. Certainly, what we saw happening in Yemen with the support he was giving to Saudis and the Emiratis. Certainly the expansion of the wars in Africa. All those types of things were occurring, and then you saw, Obama smartly and rightly, and one of the things I wish we still had Barack Obama in office for is the fact that I think he would have handled this war in Ukraine in a much better, calmer, and realist fashion than the Biden administration did. But Obama, as people remember, wouldn't send weapons to Ukraine. And his whole rationale was like, look, the Russians will always have escalation dominance here. And he wasn't talking about weapons. He was talking about reason, motive, right? I mean, the sense that we can never care as much about Ukraine as Russia does. And Barack Obama understood that, right? And so he would never send weapons there. When Trump comes in, he starts sending the weapons. You see, as Obama had put sanctions in place against Russia in his last term, but you saw this, particularly in his last year, you saw the Trump administration really put a whole ton of sanctions on Russia, right? So at the point where even when the Biden administration comes in, if they had wanted to do something different with Russia, I'm not really sure what could have been done at that point. And the same, of course, with Iran. Israel moves the embassy and allows, oh yeah, you guys annexed the Golan Heights, great. We're changing our sign and our, we're making sure that's official with us too. So yeah,
pulling out of
Trump
the JCPOA.
What's that?
Pulling out of that JCPOA for Iran.
Well, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Another thing. There's other but certainly what we're looking at with this administration, who he's got coming in, we haven't, the who they staff the State Department with. So the guy who they put in charge of staffing the State Department, a guy named Brian Cook, who is as anti-Iran as you get. And now I think what is occurring, and what I'm very fearful of, particularly this last week, as the drumbeat on Iran has really increased. So we dealt in December with Panama and Greenland and things like that, and I'm going to end the Ukraine war on the first day. And now the drumbeat has been the last week about Iran, this idea that if the hostages are not released by the day I'm sworn in, they'll be hell to pay. And he's not talking about the Palestinians, he's not talking about Hamas. The U.S. might do some airstrikes in Gaza just to make sure that no one could ever argue we didn't fully participate in the genocide, right? But the main thing, when these people like Waltz, Rubio, Cook talk about who's responsible for the hostages, they're talking about Iran. Everything to them has an Iran focus. Iran to these people is their white whale. And the hostages give these people the casus belli, right? The reason for war with Iran, they may have been looking for a long time. So there's no certainty, of course, that they're going to launch strikes against Iran. But I am in a worse place in terms of how I feel about it. The possibility, the likelihood of U.S. military action against Iran after Trump takes office than I have been even over this last year. Because the chance to now go after the white whale is there. And of course, the idea being that, Trump is Ahab, or our foreign policy community is Ahab, the blob is Ahab, right? And what that does, right? I mean, so yeah.
I think it's pretty likely, in my opinion, that some limited operation against Iran happens, something like a Operation Praying Mantis 2 or something like that, where we strike some critical infrastructure and oil or something like that.
I think to dovetail with what the Israelis want, it has to be a continuous 1 to 2 year thing. And I say that because the Israelis are coming upon their main goal. Their main goal has been to annex the West Bank. Everything else has been a supporting effort. Even the destruction, the genocide of Gaza has essentially been a supporting effort to prepare for the annexation of the West Bank. We saw happen with Lebanon and Syria, checking Iran essentially, have all been supporting efforts for the coming West Bank annexation, right? Preparing the conditions to allow for no one to interfere with or distract from the annexation. They're going to need a heck of a lot of their manpower needs are going to be massive to do this. The Israelis, I don't know if you guys saw this, they're going to create 5 new reserve brigades for reservists men and women 38 to 58 years old.
Oh my God.
Right. And the idea being you can bring in these old men and I'm 51. I could be a part of that. You know, you can have some, broke, 51-year-old dude like me. He can stand a post. I can run a checkpoint, and the younger kids, the younger men and women,
they'll go out and
those
do
are the
the
ones who
fighting.
need to be on the street, kicking indoors, shooting babies in the head, whatever they need them to do,
Yikes.
So yeah, I mean, so the idea where this again dovetails with the Israelis is that you need a continuous effort against Iran to, one, potentially take pressure off of Israel, but just as importantly, to distract from what's occurring in the West Bank. If you have this continuous kind of war, quasi-war, strikes between the U.S. and Iran lasting a year or two, that's where all the media attention is going to be. And what little media attention there is in the way, it'll be worse than Gaza, because there'll be this constant distraction.
There's already
right?
there's already plenty of distraction against from Gaza. Like, it's just no one's really talking about it. Just read a report recently that I think it was like 6% of the Gaza is now gone, whether dead now or having fled.
Right.
That nobody heard about. No one cares. Like,
and that's if you're taking the numbers at face value.
Of course,
which nobody does, right?
Yeah, of course.
Nobody does, and we'll never know. I mean, like you look at I saw another map today, a satellite map today of a before and after, right? Of what, and I can't even remember. It's true. Even someone like myself, or I'm sure maybe it's the same for you guys. I'm sure plenty of the folks who are listening, you become numb to it. And so I've got, I put Al Jazeera on every day, and I half listen to the Gaza stuff now, because it's all 51 killed in the last 24 hours, 72 killed in the last 24 hours. I mean, like this hospital's being destroyed. Right? I mean, like
school. This,
it does. It become, and for people who we care, it's still so. Even for us, you kind of start to glaze over, which is like, it's horrible to say that, but it's true.
Kind of happened with Ukraine for us as well, right? In the beginning, we were very, very invested, and then now it's just like, I'll check in on it maybe once a month,
Oh,
let's see. Yeah, it's like, let's look at the battle lines. And then
it happened
go
with
back
Iraq.
to your day.
I remember being in the Chow Hall, 29 Palms, in 2006, getting ready to take my company over to Iraq, and this is when Israel invaded Lebanon in 06. And I remember like being at Chow Hall, and the news, the CNN, Fox, whatever, that's all they were talking about. And I remember thinking like, man, we've already got 2 wars of our own. You guys won't even talk about that, right?
Right.
I mean, like, but you saw that happen with the Iraq war. I remember all of us who came home from it, even in 05, it was, that's still going on? You guys are still over there? And Afghanistan was even worse.
Right.
We got troops in Afghanistan? Really? What's this Obama guy talking about?
Right.
I mean, so that was, so I think the dovetailing there of the U.S. obsession with Iran, right? The white whale that it is, it's been generational. I mean, this is 46 years now, right? If I'm doing math in my head, right? 79 to, now. And, it is an obsession with the foreign policy, national security communities in the U.S. The media as well, continually for decades, has been stoking American fear, angst, anger, whatever you want to call it.
Yellow journalism.
Iran, right? Yeah, I mean, you see these surveys that come out. Who's the biggest threat to the United States?
Yeah.
And Iran's not always the first. Sometimes it's Russia or China or Iraq or whoever. But Iran's always in the top 3.
Yep.
For 40 years now. I don't think they've probably never fallen out of the top 3. I mean, so the environment for this has been here for decades, and this obsession with it. Again, it works really well with the Israeli needs to ensure that they're able to focus on the West Bank without having to worry about anything else. Because certainly a U.S. attack on Iran would further isolate Hezbollah, right? Would further, maybe that would be the trick that we need to get the Yemenis to knock off what they're doing in the Red Sea. Because certainly militarily, we're not going to defeat these guys. The Saudis couldn't do it. The Emiratis couldn't do it. The Americans, the Brits could do it now. Maybe the Israelis think that with the Yemenis, they can do to the Yemenis, to Ansar Allah or the Houthis, they could do to them what they did to Hezbollah. I doubt it if the Saudis couldn't do it for 9 years or however long, longer than that, 7 years.
That's with our support too, yeah.
Yeah, and that's with our support. Yeah. So, I mean, it's a really shitty situation as we go into 2025. I mean, looking at what Israel and the U.S. has been able to accomplish. They've effectively gotten to their phase in Gaza, where North Gaza, the ethnic cleansing is going successfully, right? They are now starting they've Beit Lahia and the towns in the north, they've cleansed. And they are now working on Gaza City, and they will, within a few months, have the northern part of Gaza cleansed. You know, what Palestinians that remain in the north there will be in concentration camps. And then the settlers will come in. And for those south of the Netzarim corridor, so the southern 2/3, 70% of Gaza, where everyone's going to be, or those who left, you know, still, it's going to be, I don't think the Israelis really have a plan for that because they really don't care. I think there's some fantasy that the Egyptians may open up or the Jordanians may open up or these cruise liners are going to come and take these people to Paraguay or wherever, you know. But I think a year from now, what we'll be seeing on the news about or seeing on our phones and reading about Gaza will be the same as we hear now, the same as we heard a year ago. 70 killed in an airstrike. Only 25 trucks got in today. You know, the ninth baby died freezing last night. You know, we'll hear the same because that's the Israeli plan. They really don't have a plan for the southern Gaza yet, as far as I can tell, other than like, we'll deal with that in the future. We got what we want in the north. We've destroyed essentially Hamas's military capability. We don't have to worry about them. We can limit what we're doing there. Certainly their success in Lebanon, pulling Hezbollah off the battlefield. We'll see what happens in the next couple of weeks as the ceasefire ends. And certainly what happened in Syria, they are ecstatic about. They've checked Iran, essentially. Yemenis are still a huge pain in the ass to them, but it's not going to stop them. And yeah, if they get the Americans to come on board, this annexation of the West Bank, what's going to stop them?
Hey, Matt, can we get your take on Syria?
Yeah.
So everyone is saying it's like, all right, so they got rid of Assad. They cut off the land bridge to Hezbollah.
I hate that. It's a fucking
I know.
road, guys.
I know. That's why we like saying it, the land bridge. But everyone's like, oh yeah, this is like some huge Israeli victory. And I don't really see it that way. I kind of see it as like a big future problem. Because who's going to want to have a state next to HTS? Like, that doesn't seem great. And I mean, we were talking, Danny, I think we were talking about this. Like, what if they like kicked all the Hamas guys out into Syria or something like that?
That was one of like the proposed options.
Right.
Yeah. What if they just join up? Like, wouldn't they just join up together?
Reconstitute
and,
in general, yeah.
Yeah, wouldn't they have the...
Yeah. Yeah, you would,
go ahead, Matt.
You would think that would be the case, right? You would think that would be the fear that these fighters, opposition fighters, the HCS fighters, these jihadists, whatever you want to call them, the Sunnis predominantly, would see their brothers and sisters in Palestine, and that will be the next great fight for them. Certainly, that's what emboldened that's what gave fervor to. That's what inspired the previous generations of Al Qaeda. And HTS as being a successor to that, right? Certainly, you look at what the 9/11 hijackers say, right? And Israel is right in there. That's the, Muhammad Atta. He gives his life to Al Qaeda after Operation Grapes of Wrath in 1996 or 1997, and the Israelis kill hundreds in Lebanon, through airstrikes. And that's when Muhammad Atta said, "This is what I'm going to do with my life. I'm going to dedicate myself to fighting this great evil." And then the other hijackers all had similar type of things, and certainly Bin Laden, right? And his, why are we fighting the U.S.? Because the U.S. supports Israel, because the U.S. supports these corrupt monarchies, because the U.S. is sanctioning and killing and bombing the people of Iraq and killing them, and they've got troops in the most holy of our lands. I mean, like that's the foundational. That's the foundation of where these guys come from. So you would think, right, that why is that not the great fear? I mean, certainly Jordan as well. Why aren't the Jordanians scared to death of these guys? Because part of their whole thing was to get rid of these despots, of these illegitimate and corrupt monarchs that the West has put in place, right? So wouldn't King Abdullah in Oman be next on the list? Makes sense. But this generation, this HTS, one, they may be more localized in their view, right? So they may be more like the Afghan Taliban. And I'm speculating here. I mean, we're all still waiting for the dust to settle here. I don't trust these guys as far as I can throw them. So I'm just trying to work through this with you on why the Israelis may be confident in this, and this is trying to take an Israeli perspective, right? That they may be more like the Afghan Taliban, that they don't care about a worldwide caliphate. They're concerned locally, and that these are Syrians, and that they're concerned about Syria. So if we give them Syria, if we let them have Syria, then they will be manageable. I think you're right, though, in a sense that it's incredibly problematic. You're expecting these organizations to give up their foundations, essentially. The other issues you have is that Syria is a great game. It's a great game. I mean, the involvement of the Turks is paramount, but the Turks' priority is not Damascus. The Turks' priority is Rojava, right?
PKK.
Right, exactly. The Kurds in the east, that's their priority. But HTS could have taken Damascus, couldn't have survived all these years without the Turks.
That's right.
Right? So you have that. I mean, but you have as well, then, too, you have the Americans there. And the Americans' relationship with the Kurds. You have the Israeli relationship with the Kurds, where people might not know this, but for many years, up until last year, essentially, the Israelis were getting hundreds of thousands of barrels of oil every day from the Kurds. So that people who think the whole conspiracy about the U.S. being in Syria for oil and tying Israel into that, guess what, folks? It actually does work, because those Syrian oil fields in the east that the U.S. military controlled, Syrian Kurds took that oil, sent it to their cousins, their Kurdish cousins in Iraq. They processed it, refined it, or just sent it raw through the pipeline up to Turkey, and then Turkey shipped that down to Israel. And so when Donald Trump talked about keeping our troops there to maintain the oil fields, who was the end customer? It was Israel. I mean, so that, of course, over the last year fell apart because of internal Iraqi Kurdish disagreements over who gets the money for shipping the oil, all that type of stuff, as you would expect. But I mean, so there's a lot of complications here, because if there's that relationship with the Kurds in Israel, and there's the relationship with America in Israel, but there's also Turkey, and then of course the Russians are there, and who knows what the Qataris and the Saudis have been saying and doing. So it really is this great game, and HTS, to its credit, seems pretty wise and pretty mature in terms of not moving forward on anything. In terms of the dust is still not settled. We just don't know how things are shaking out. I can't believe that the Russians are still there, right?
Yeah.
I figured that was the first thing from the Americans when Barbara Leaf, who's who's the senior diplomat for the Middle East for the United States, when Barbara Leaf goes, a week and a half, 2 weeks after HTS takes Damascus, Leaf is there, and so this is prominent, this is huge. And you have to imagine the first thing on her list was maybe not the first. The first was probably like, don't mess with Israel, let them do what they need to do. And then the second was probably kick the Russians out. And in this past weekend, when the French foreign minister and the German foreign minister were there, you got to imagine that was the top of their list. Kick the Russians out. And they haven't done that yet, right? I mean, so are these transactional jihadists that we're seeing? And is that the Israeli perspective, that they feel they can manage these guys? It was Max Blumenthal's book. People haven't read it. Great book to understand kind of what I'm talking about.
I've read it. I got it. I have it on my bookshelf.
The management of savagery, right? And so to your point then, exactly, Henry, how do you expect this is going to work? You're trying to manage savagery. And so this idea that it could all blow up, right? But for Israel, the main thing is, can you keep it? Can we continue to use Syria as a way to isolate Hezbollah from Iran, which then takes pressure off of our north and allows us to concentrate in the West Bank? We just need this to work for 1 or 2 or 3 years, and then we can go back to whatever. I think one of the big issues, of course, is going to be this collision between Israel and Turkey, right? This, these various interests that are there, that's going to come to a head. I mean, how does that not come to a head in a year or two? Particularly, and now whether Erdogan ever actually puts up, and matches his rhetoric with deeds, we'll see.
It's really a
this
lot
idea
like
of managing the HTS is it's a crazy thing, but that's what they keep doing. And they've also said it before too. You've had senior Israelis who've said, during the Syrian civil war, they would much rather have Al Qaeda in charge of Damascus than the Assad government be in charge, because their whole perception is through this idea that Iran is their chief adversary and is what is blocking them from doing what they want with Palestine. And then if you can get rid of Iran as this great puppet master, then Hezbollah can't do anything. The Palestinians can't do anything. No one can stand up to us. We can do what we need to do.
This really feels a lot like World War I conditions with all these complicated alliance systems. Specifically what you called out, like how does Israel and Turkey resolve itself with the seemingly counterintuitive, motivations and interests in Syria. Because
Danny, it's this idea that the concept of the enemy of my enemy is my friend works as long as there's only two other people involved in that. Once you start bringing in more enemies and more friends, it doesn't work.
The enemy of my enemy's enemy is my friend, unless he's my enemy because my other friend is his enemy, right? Something like that.
Yeah. I mean, essentially, it's
If I'm the Israelis, I think I would rather have this kind of impotent Assad regime next to me than this unpredictable HTS regime,
right?
Because know what you have with Assad. Like, you can bomb Syria with impunity for the most part. They have no ability to attack you. The only really big problem is that there's a they act as a conduit to Hezbollah. But now this new government, this HTS government, is like talking about, Russia and Syria have had historic ties. We want to maintain those ties. And then I didn't see this part of the interview, so I just heard about it. So correct me if I'm wrong. But they're talking about having good relations with Iran. I mean, if that happens, will Syria's position even change that much from the Assad government? It's kind of hard for me to. Oh, go on.
Yeah, I think these guys coming out of Idlib are very savvy. At least they're trying to be, and they know the good thing they got going on right now, and they're trying to get as much as they can. So certainly when they came in, Iran needs to get out. Iran needs to be held for all its crimes in Syria, et cetera, et cetera. So they had that line. But if what you're saying is true about, we can be friends with the Iranians. Is that being said because their foreign minister, the new Syrian foreign minister, is in Qatar, is in Saudi Arabia, right? Is it being said because Annalisa Baerbock is showing up from Germany, and we've got to put some type of fear in them, try and have some leverage, try and give them some reason to think that we won't roll over for them. Is that potentially it? Or do they really think that way? I can't imagine they think that way, both for ideological reasons as well as just for the reality of the war of the last 14 years or whatever. But yeah, maybe.
Well,
maybe.
Matt, let me add something. The sanctions are still on Syria, technically, right? Like all these,
they just removed them, or
they just
some
removed
of them. Particularly, in particular, they removed the energy sector sanctions. Anything that can be, as well as other sanctions that would have some type of humanitarian effect. The sanctions against the old government are still there, but also too the sanctions, interestingly, against HTS are still there. And the Treasury Department said they will look at that 6 months from now and then decide how they're going to handle that. But as of yesterday or whenever it was, they did remove many of the sanctions on Syria, particularly those regarding the energy sector, which is really important for the Syrian people, regardless of what you think about the whole thing. The reality is the Syrian people have been suffering so terribly for the last 14 years. And so they do need, that type of sanction relief.
They need a bone,
which is something
sure.
that, many of us have been arguing for, since they put these sanctions in place, particularly in 17 or so, when they really put these draconian sanctions in place.
Well, there's got to be some payoff, if they're going to accept this regime change. Like, wasn't that the promise to begin with, that, if you remove Assad, your quality of life is going to go up?
Right.
I mean,
right.
what?
And the sanctions were integral. I think a lot of us were surprised at how quickly the Assad government collapsed, right? And then I think a lot of us too, after a week or 2 or 3, we put some thought into it, kind of thought about it. We kind of added it all up. It was like, I don't know how that guy was surviving, and this, right? I mean, like, basically
how
a feather would knock the government over. And that's what happened. I mean, essentially, they were knocked over with a feather. I mean, there were people killed and things like that, but it wasn't, to look at what occurred in a span of 2.5 weeks. I was in Ireland actually when Damascus fell, and I went to bed, and HTS was outside of Homs. And I woke up in the morning, 8 hours later, and Assad was on a plane to Moscow. How quickly it happened.
Well, Assad quit like a couple years ago, I feel like. And then, it was definitely evident that he did, because as soon as he went back to Moscow, he was like, no, I'm good. I'm going to start a ophthalmology practice. I'm just going to live my life. And juicy follow-up detail, apparently his wife is now filing for a divorce for him, and she's going to go back to Britain.
Really?
She's a dual
I heard
national.
I heard that was a bunch of bullshit.
Well, I like to believe it because
His
it's
wife
more
is
like a
very
reality
sick.
TV show that way. But like, imagine like the Keeping Up with the Assads reality TV show. Like the premise is, this former dictator has to escape to Moscow, and he has to start an ophthalmology clinic.
Right. It work out really well, right? Because all during his time, he's bought property in Russia. He's shipped gold over there.
Right.
And then he falls victim to like Russia's divorce laws, and she takes everything from him.
Exactly. Right. Exactly.
His kids are there too. I think his kids go to school there. His wife has like aggressive leukemia.
Yeah, I saw something about that too.
So I don't know. I don't really care that much about the personal details of his life. I guess the main thing I'm interested in is like what's going to happen, because one of the reasons that the Assad government fell so quickly is because I think the average soldier was making something like, man, I forget this number. It was something like $10 a week or something like that, or even less. Like they weren't able to pay the army. And these HTS guys, like, what are they getting? Like $1,000 a month? More than that?
Yeah.
I mean, you would know better than I would, but like how much?
Yeah, I don't know.
A jihadi merc goes for.
Right, and certainly they've had the backing of Turkey for all these years, so they lived pretty well in Idlib. I mean, I think a lot of us weren't sure what was happening in this enclave they've had there, like what's going on, and obviously now we knew that they were re-equipping, they were getting better, they were getting training, they were organized, they were running the city. And they had resources.
They were incredibly organized. So I said this in the last episode, and I was super surprised when I heard about HTS way back when, when the Syrian civil war had kicked off, when they started being relevant. And then I just forgot about them. And then I'm like, oh, who are these HTS guys again? And I start reading into it, and I'm like, they ran an economy. They did trade. They traded with Turkey. Like they were making their own weapons. Like they were manufacturing things. And evidently, like relatively speaking, I'm not trying to like give them too much props, but relatively speaking, they ran a tight ship in Idlib and were very competent. And I was like, okay, well that makes the whole situation of them taking over the Syrian government a little bit more interesting, because clearly they figured something out, smaller scale, but still, like this isn't like some random ragtag group of people who have no idea what they're doing. Yes, you have to give them the fact that Turkey was supporting them, for sure. I'll give you that. But it's like you pointed out a lot of, in the top of the show, you could give people money and they could waste it frivolously, right? So,
absolutely.
You have to have a level of competence on top of some foreign backing in order to get shit done. So, It's pretty interesting.
Yeah, and we'll see what they do. I mean, many of the people that were running their government, their Salvation government, as they called it, in Idlib, are now in those positions, the same positions, but on a national level in Damascus. And that's what you would expect. Why would anyone do anything differently?
Right.
And we'll see what they do over the next year or two. I know they said that elections won't be for 4 years out, and they've already started changing the school curriculum. And I don't know if you guys saw when Annalisa Baerbock, the German foreign minister, was there over the weekend. Some Syrian press release, they had her face and hair obscured, right? Yeah. So I mean, you're gonna. So we'll see what they do. Will they be like the Afghan Taliban? And just be ruinous to their population in pursuit of the Islamic government that they want? Or are they going to be more transactional? Or do they realize that they are in a pretty precarious position, that they owe their place to the Turks as well as to the benevolence of the Americans? And are they? But the idea, I think, there's a Daoud, who was the prime minister of Afghanistan in the 70s. He's the one who threw out his uncle or cousin. I can't remember which the king was. But Dawood takes over, and he's the prime minister in Afghanistan. And he said, I light my American cigarettes with Soviet lighters, right? And, how well did that work out for you in Afghanistan?
Yeah.
So that's something that the Syrians have to, this new Syrian government has to be very careful of, is like, don't think you're so smart. Don't think that you have leverage where you might not. And that what you can bring in is something unpredictable or that you can't foresee. And they've been very, again, vague on what they're going to do. They've said the right things, but when it comes to the Kurds, you've seen them say both things, right? Where the Kurds cannot be autonomous, there will be no secondary or other type of citizenship in this country. The Kurds will be assimilated. To at the same time saying like, no, we're cool with the Kurds. We're looking forward to working with them. And maybe that's part of the deal for the Americans. I was saying before, the Kurds used to ship the oil, truck the oil to their cousins in Iraq, who would then put it in a pipeline, and the Turks would put it on a ship and bring it down to Israel. Maybe now they'll just ship that oil directly from eastern Syria. The Kurds get a cut, HTS gets a cut, and then the Israelis get discounted oil. A couple 100,000 barrels of discounted oil every day. Maybe that's one of the deals that's being made. I don't know, like just pure speculation, fantasy on my part, but something's being offered in all these meetings. I mean, every day there's a different delegation in Damascus. Every day this week, the Syrian foreign minister has been someplace else. I think he was in Jordan today. So these aren't just like, hey, how you doing meetings? Get to know each other, break the ice, play a fun game to know one another. I mean, these are serious meetings where things are being offered and things are also being threatened. And, we'll see what HTS does out of this. But, the idea of this great game that's there, man, if this was a television show, if this was a Netflix series, it'd be fantastic. Except the reality is it's coming after 5,600,000 Syrians have died. 10 million are still refugees. The country is just destroyed. I will say one thing, that similar to the Afghan Taliban, which was surprising, I think, to many of us, that the bloodletting, the score settling, doesn't seem to be as severe as you'd expect it to be. No. So when the Afghan Taliban took power in 21, a lot of us, me included, thought it was going to be terrible bloodletting. And there wasn't. The United Nations tally is in the low hundreds that they could count of extrajudicial killings after the Taliban took power. And many of us, I think, would have thought be in the thousands. And the same in Syria. It's hard to get a good handle on what's occurring there because you do hear reports of atrocities and things like that. You see the videos of people being killed, but those are in the ones and twos. Maybe there's others I haven't seen, right? So it's been a fairly limited score settling, and you're hearing mixed things about how the Alawites and the Christians are being treated and stuff. So, we'll just, again, another thing we'll have to wait for the dust to settle and see what these guys actually do.
Matt, I saw this video of this nightclub in Damascus, and it looked like a nightclub that would in New York. And there was these HTS guys there as bodyguards, and like women were dressed like, women in the West. I don't know if that was like for show or what. But then on the other hand, you hear about like massacres. I have no way to verify like any of this information, if it's true, if it's being played up on the internet, because I mean, frankly, there is a lot of stuff on the internet that's not true. But I'm sure there has been there's been retaliations, but who knows if if it was some personal score or something like that, or if it was some guy going through a Christian neighborhood and grabbing somebody out of a car and lynching him. I mean, I think from what I've seen, it doesn't seem, I don't want to say this, but it seems like they're being kind of nice about it right now, but
exactly. Yeah. I mean, you see these guys getting thrown to the ground and shot up with a dozen Kalashnikov rounds, and part of your things, maybe that guy deserved it. I mean, like, what did that guy do these last 12 years to get himself shot like that? Same thing too around Christmas. I saw reports of Christians being, persecuted or being oppressed or something happening. And then you see other reports, oh, no, they're lighting up Christmas trees. So you don't know. We don't know what's happening there. I think a lot of it is many of us, Danny, I agree with you. I had to go back and look up how to pronounce Hayat Tahrir al-Sham.
Yes,
I mean, I hadn't pronounced those words in years.
Right.
And most of us were so focused on Syria just as being the land bridge, right? And these constant Israeli airstrikes and everything else that, this conception that something like that happened. And I don't really know. Kevork Amassian, who's a very good commentator, he's based in Germany, he's Syrian. He said things a few months ago where he was hearing that there may be some type of push out of Idlib. But, I don't know if anyone else who knew anything like this or thought anything like this. And if they go back and look at their 2024 projections, I don't know of anyone who had called this right
wasn't on my bingo card.
In a sense that,
nope.
Yeah, exactly. I did.
Now that it happens, it makes so much sense. It's like,
exactly. When you look at it, right? When you look at the sanctions, you look at the fact that the Americans are controlling the Syrian oil and wheat fields. You look, as we said, how the Turks have been building these guys up safely and protected in Idlib for all these years. Mm-hmm. The fact that Assad's government couldn't pay their troops, which is probably the biggest thing. I mean, that's what happens in Afghanistan is once the fear comes in 21 that the money is going to stop coming, that's it. These guys start putting down their weapons and going home. I saw that in 2009 when I was there. One time the Afghan police in the province I were in didn't get paid for whatever reason. They went home. They went back to the north. A lot of these guys are doing this in these armies because this is what's keeping their family alive. So that $10 a month they were getting in Syria, maybe that's what was keeping their families from starving, and then when that doesn't show up or they think it doesn't show up or what are you going to die for then? So I think that probably had a huge role to play. But
is that why the bloodletting in Iraq was so extreme? Because they just like took these guys from, in the Iraqi army off the pay dole with no means, or what makes the situation different?
Well, I think that was certainly you put people out there. That had more to do with the humiliation of it, though. That had more idea of usurpation, right? Again, this invasion, this occupation, and then the humiliation of firing these people, sending them home. Talking about when the United States disbands the Iraqi army in 2003. There was going to be resistance anyway. There was going to be an insurgency anyway. But certainly the leadership of the Iraqi army, and this is from Turkish time, this is from Ottoman times, then later on kind of continued by the British in the same way. Why are the Alawites, this minority population in Syria, in control of the of the Syrian military and everything? Well, it goes back to the Ottoman times. And then when the French came, the Alawites were happy to stay in those positions, and so they were in control of the army. And the same. So what you had in Iraq was you had not all, but a good percentage of the Sunni, the Iraqi army leadership was Sunni. And so when you humiliated these guys, maybe if they weren't predisposed to fighting the occupation before, now they definitely were. I am very reluctant to agree with the idea with the occupation, with the resistance to the American occupation of Iraq, that it was because these people were only getting paid by the resistance to fight. I am very skeptical of that. I have never seen anything authoritative to prove that to me. This was the thesis that they went into Afghanistan with McChrystal and his people in Afghanistan with, that these Taliban fighters are only doing it because they're being paid. And this is one of the realities of the American ego, of the American imperial mindset, is that what we are doing is just, it's right. We are the exceptional nation. You know, it's that great quote from Full Metal Jacket, right? Where Matthew Modine's character, Joker, is confronted by this general or colonel, and Matthew Modine's got a peace symbol on his helmet or something like that. And the general says, the colonel's like, come on, get on the team. Don't you know what's going on here? Inside every gook is an American dying to get out, right? That type of mindset, that belief that what we're doing is just and right. And so the idea of these people fighting us because we're occupying them is just, it's inconceivable. And it actually was forbidden. I remember where I was standing at the top of the 42nd Infantry Division in Tikrit, when someone said along the lines like, we can start using the word insurgency. Because for 2 years in Iraq, the senior Department of Defense leadership, the idea of there being an insurgency, well, that invalidates what we're doing there. The idea of an insurgency legitimizes this idea of resistance to occupation. Mm-hmm. Right? So you can't even say those words. So how are you going to actually fight a war and win a war if you can't even use the words to define the war? Right? So this idea then that, but what you'd see is that, and this is the same in Afghanistan, you go into briefings and there'd be the intel officer up there and he'd have the org chart of the insurgency, and it would be look like a org chart like you'd see in The Wire about the gangs in Baltimore or something like that. Mm-hmm. And, and then why are these guys doing this? Oh, it's because there's criminal elements. It's because they're former regime elements. It's because they're crazy jihadists, right? It's because they're broke and they need money, mm-hmm. And you'd never see an explanation for the resistance being about national liberation, which it was for almost all of them, And so I'm very skeptical. I know we're going off on this, but very skeptical of the idea that if we had just kept the Iraqi army together, things would have been better, But there's certainly, to your point though, disbanding it was a terrible idea. You put guys on the street without money. You cause just that type of angst and fear, right, and distrust, as well as furthering the humiliation that leads to people being like, yeah, what are we doing here? Why are these guys occupying us? We were the army. We could have, and just leads to more of a mindset of like, we have to resist the occupiers. So
yeah, it's like the reduction. When you reduce somebody's like purpose, is when they resort to resistance more so than just the monetary,
right? And
their identity, really.
Yeah, you had in Iraq, and this was Paul Wolfowitz's big thing, the deputy to Donald Rumsfeld, was the de-Baathification, and Wolfowitz openly said the Ba'ath Party is akin to the Nazi Party. And, not understanding that to be in any position of government, you had to be part of the Ba'ath Party. Teachers are Ba'ath Party members, and so you had this crusade, you had this inquisition against normal people who were deemed unable to keep their jobs, unable to get new jobs because they were Baathists. And this falls then into the whole idea that empires have always used, right, of divide and conquer. And so if you're on the other side of that divide and conquer equation from the empire, what do you do? What do you have going for you? Who can you ally with? So all these things. I need to wrap up here, guys. I appreciate this.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, awesome, man. As always, Matt, we really appreciate you coming on and speaking with us. This is an episode that I'm going to look through the transcript because I need to see all these names to conceptualize this. It was really fascinating. I've never really heard a breakdown like the one that you gave. I'll be honest. Like, I knew it was convoluted, but it's just like a hot mess. And like, I wonder if what I'm thinking is, I wonder if it was always like this. Was it always like this? Was it like this during Vietnam? Was it like this during Korea? Like, could it have been this crazy? I think so. Was it like this at Valley Forge, right, in 1777 or whatever? I would imagine, yeah. I mean, we're human beings, and I would think so. Maybe it's a little
Yeah, I would imagine so. I would imagine so.
Like I would imagine World War One was like this. It's hard for me to imagine that World War. I guess World War One too, but it's hard for me to imagine World War Two was like this when like the objective was like winning the war.
Well,
right?
I mean, look at World War II when FDR dies. Was he the glue that was holding it all together? Because then when Truman takes over, you have the Secretary of State, Jimmy Burns, who is able to just basically control American foreign policy, right? So Burns is the one who, where there have been this idea, particularly Henry Wallace, and where and others have been in favor of some sort of cooperation with the Soviet Union going forward. FDR seems to have been, that was anathema to Jimmy Burns. And so Jimmy Burns is able to essentially control Truman. And there was a lot of political reasons for that before. But yeah, you see that as well. So was FDR the guy kind of all holding it together? And then when he went, it shoots apart. I don't know. I mean, but I would suspect it's probably always been like this.
Well, you know what what James Billington said about the French revolutionaries, what their primary motivation was? The need for simplification. All right, Matt, I'll let you go. I know you got to run. Thank you so much for giving us so much of your time. We hope to do it again. Plug your stuff before you leave, though. Where to find your work, your Substack, all of that.
Yeah, thank you. I'm the associate director of the Eisenhower Media Network. You can Google that. On Twitter, it's Matthew P. Hoh, P as in Patrick, last name spelled H-O-H. And yeah, and on Substack, it's Matthew Hoh on Substack or whatever it is. I don't know.
We'll link it.
Yeah, we'll link it. Awesome. All right, I'll let you go, Matt.
All right, thanks, guys. You have a happy New Year.
Happy New Year.